The first day on the job with Cousin Laurent went like a breeze. Don caught on pretty quickly, learning the ropes around the world of carpentry. Long afternoons were spent sitting on the back steps to several mansions, throwing back 6-packs of natural light, and long talks about investing and spending the money they're making off the current jobs. Don had been studying Laurent and realized that Laurent was a terrible steward of finances. Laurent didn't respect his money, so plenty of it was misplaced and mismanaged. He gave most of his earnings to his mama, Aunt Laura, who in return constantly relocated and rented houses with spare land in different counties to shelter her young children. Laurent was the oldest out of the children and acted as a father figure by handing over bulks of his money at a time on a consistent basis. Don had to get off the Laurent's job train. The days were long and tiring, and there were gaps where he waited on pay. The temperature reached 105 degrees, and the cement was hot enough to fry an egg on the asphalt. Don came up with a brilliant idea and decided to invest in himself with a small startup business to keep him cool in the shade. He refused to be working in brand new built homes still in their framed architecture stage without any air conditioning. Don called up Aunt Laura and asked if she still had the apartment connection in Orange County and that he needed a place to stay ASAP with some AC. She told Don to give her a few hours and she will call him back with the information he had requested. Don was sitting pretty on a nice nest egg of cash, so he was ready to make a move at any minute. Laurent and Don worked on 3 homes on Franklin Street simultaneously, building frames, sheetrocking, and painting new trim and walls. The end of the workday was here, and Tierra pulled into the grassy knoll driveway, squeezing on the side of Big Whitey, Laurent's infamous organized commercial work van. Tierra was all about her son Don. She would arrive at the worksite or wherever Don summoned her to appear, and she would strictly have laser focus on Don. It was like she never even took the time to consider communicating with anyone else present. She would say hi and bye, fashionably in that order. Don gave Laurent dap and sat in the car greeting Tierra as she began placing the car in reverse to head back to Durham. Don decided to hang around Tierra and her neighborhood for a while and give Laurent a break. The heat was too draining to work in for Don. Laurent and his ladder kept running the streets of Chapel Hill, turning corner to corner from job to job. Don chauffeured Tierra to NCCU to class 4 days a week and returned in the afternoons to pick her up. At first, driving her to and fro seemed to be a great, well-thought idea. It wasn't. Don became fatigued and realized he didn't have any real spare time for himself. When he tried to make a move, he noticed it would be time to pick up Tierra from school. Days were spent walking through the neighborhood. This area was strange. There were 2 entrances to Tierra's apartment complex. One was always closed. The face of the complex was highly visible from Interstate 85 South, where Tierra's building had a huge advertisement to attract new tenants, making it a great place to live. Once one drove through the back entrance, they would realize the property was located dead smack in the middle of the hood. A one-way in, one-way out with adjacent side blocks and heavy drug activity that reminded Don of 115th Street in Harlem. Young men running up to cars, making drug transactions in the broad day without a care in the world. The young men recognized Don. He always drove Tierra's car through their little drug strip with the windows down, or Tierra would drive with the music blasting. One day, Don walked to the store, and one of the young men named Rocco gave him dap and introduced him to the group of youngsters that seemed to actually live outside 24 hours every day. Don felt embraced and got that block boss and leader vibe as when he ran with PA. Don shook it off and continued walking to the local BP gas station store on Guess Road. Fighting curiosity and his money-making conscience, Don struggled with thoughts of the life, which came to a crash with thoughts of him violating his parole. Aunt Laura called and told Don to meet her and his baby cousin I.M.S. out on Highway 54 in Carborough at Sunny Lake Apartments to do a walkthrough. I.M.S. was Laurent's younger and middle brother. Aunt Laura had a perfect plan to get I.M.S. out of her house to be on his own. I.M.S. had little credit and just started working, just not enough cash to clear a security deposit for the rental contract. Aunt Laura figured to add Don on the lease, and her daughter-in-law Yolanda, who was the property manager, would do her magic and make it work. And she did. Yolanda rolled up on a golf cart with 2 sets of keys and handed them to Aunt Laura. Everything started out great with the tour and turned sour by the seconds. Don noticed the place was only a 1-bedroom flat. He swallowed his pride, knowing Iceman looked up to him, and he did agree inside that he needed a place to lay his head in case things didn't go well with Tierra. Don learned young, as a man, it was cool to lay and play with women. He just always made it a must to pay for his own roof over his head. Don returned to Tierra's place, and the two would spend hours watching reality TV shows. Don relaxed, and it was a way for him to catch up on all the time he missed in the joint. Tierra would always lecture Don about how she felt the need for him to cut his cousin Leron off and go into business for himself. Don ignored Tierra until one day he agreed with her that she was right. Don only knew about fast illegal hustles and heard about the myth of several hustlers going legit, making it clean out of the life. Part of Don felt that was for suckers. The truth was, Don was scared of the unknown and was impatient. He knew how to attract, organize, and get money fast. That was a tangible reality to Don, which blurred every line of hope and the possibility of living a clean, legit life. Don praised how his cousin Leron squared up with the gospel and church lifestyle. He just figured personally that wasn't his calling, and it was a Southern thing to be a born-again Christian. Don grew up with an entire different belief system. Tierra had placed the fire under his feet, and Don was ready to step out on faith and form a business. He just felt he needed more time. Don funds ran low and his game started leaking, and he knew once the money would get low, any female would try to throw a monkey wrench in his game, so he had to react fast. Tierra walked in the door, and Don was sitting there in deep thought, contemplating his next steps, like he just arrived from the prison camp. He pulled a newspaper he was reading from off the countertop and showed Tierra a seller's ad for a Mac computer for $400. The ad jumped out at Don, which made him want the computer even more. Don told Tierra he needed a little help and that he only had $100 to his name. Tierra didn't care about money or the amount of money Don ever had in his possession. All she knew was he was the apple to her eye and a one-of-a-kind. She said, "Bae, let's go to the credit union, and I will withdraw the rest and put it toward the computer. I am so excited. My bae bout to be a big businessman." And she rubbed her hands over his penis print on his pants, smiling, sticking her radiant pink tongue out, heavily wet, licking her lips. Don called CS and asked him if he could borrow $75 to get the printer that was a part of the computer sale, and he would repay him back later. CS told Don to stop by his new location, his parents' home, to pick up the loose cash. Don and Tierra drove up Guest Road across 85 South, 10 blocks away from the apartment, and made a right on Patton Street, CS's new neighborhood. Don pulled over to 703 Patton Street, a well-looking fixer-upper country-style home. CS came walking out to the car and handed Don the cash in hand. He said, "Welp, this is where I am at. It's better than the apartment I had in South Point. Plus, I can think clearer here. Since Sarah and I are no longer, it was perfect timing to come back to the nest. My parents moved out to the country to farm, so they left me in charge of this house. As a matter of fact, I have to mow the lawn now." Don thanked CS and Tierra, and he pulled off. Hours passed by, and Don and Tierra were back at her place, plugging up the computer. Don was super excited. In his eyes, it was a plan well put together. Tierra got a call, and a strange voice blurted through the back of her cell phone. It was Doris, her neighbor downstairs. Tierra opened the door and introduced Doris to Don. Doris was a heavy-set, dark-skinned NCCU alumni who just graduated the previous semester. She was also Tierra's smoke buddy. Some nights Tierra would be downstairs at Doris's apartment, smoking blunts marijuana like it was going out of style. Her eyes would be demon red. Don didn't care. He just got his rocks off and rated and compared every experience to being better than being in prison. Don identified that the computer had a CD-DVD burner, and he started ripping and downloading music offline. He felt that he had stumbled across something that could be big. One night, Tierra brung Don several hundred CD blanks, and within hours, Don burned a bin of music, packed with cheap inkjet-printed covers, ready for sale. As soon as Don dropped Tierra off for class, he was selling CDs throughout her neighborhood to the little local drug dealers and thugs. Don always had a good ear for music, so he prided himself on having the best, uncut, and latest releases on CD. Through distributing music from Durham to Chapel Hill and Carborough, Don became popular in the underworld. Don's name became a household name in Tierra's neighborhood. Don came across Gray Eyes, an OG dope boy who sold pounds of marijuana. He would always tell Don that he would trade Don some marijuana for his latest selling music catalog. One day Don agreed and returned back to Tierra's with a quarter-pound of marijuana. When Tierra came home, Don had let her in on what had happened with Gray Eyes. First thing Tierra said was, "Where's it at? Let me try it. I will tell you what you got, if it's good or not." Don caught a quick flashback, as if he was on 115th Street with a crack whore. He cleared his mind and poured her a blunt amount in her palm. Tierra kept a cigar in her purse. She had split it down the middle, stuffed it with all the marijuana she could, licked and twisted the cigar in one motion, and fired up. She blew a long, deep cloud of smoke out of her nose, talking with smoke in her mouth. Yep, bae. This is it right here." She called downstairs to Doris to come up and smoke. It was Don's lucky night. Doris had a house full of friends playing board games, drinking, and smoking. Doris walked through the door yelling, "Where's it at, bitch? Pass it here. Let me hit that shit and see what y'all working with." Tierra handed Doris the blunt, and within seconds she said, "Don, ooh baby, where did you get this from? Let me get a half-ounce of this, baby. We smoke around here." Pulling out a wad of $100 bills from her left titty, Don completely sold the majority of the marijuana to Doris and her friends. The next day, he had paid a visit to the youngsters in the neighborhood who sold dope. He quickly learned that not only marijuana was their fuel, but there was a woman who peddled marijuana to all of them, as well as the neighbors. Rocco made sure Don was safe and took him to meet Yasmin, the overweight Puerto Rican marijuana dealer from Massachusetts. Don hit it off right away with Yasmin. She was attracted to his smooth, dark skin and accent. She told Don that she's been out of marijuana for weeks and she believes her supplier was a fraud. He had her believe they would do big business. In return, she moved several pounds for him and he suddenly disappeared. From the outside looking in, if one closely paid attention to Tierra's neighborhood, it seemed to be an open drug market. The landscape was designed perfectly to hide the illegal activities taking place in plain sight, which made an excellent camouflage for the busy, steady traffic moving up and down Guess Road. Don heard enough and promised to return to supply Yasmin. Don cleared and headed to Gray Eyes for more marijuana. He convinced himself that marijuana was basically a slap on the wrist. The taste of fast money ignited Don's hustling blood within his body, and he saw only one vision: the money. Gray Eyes asked Don for the latest music, and this time he matched what Don had spent and bartered some marijuana for some music. In a week's time, Don had built his supply up to 2 pounds. Life was anew. Tierra smoked as she pleased, with what Don gave her as an allowance for calling up all of her college buddies over to their apartment to purchase marijuana. It was a revolving door. Meanwhile, around the corner, Yasmin sold her share, or marijuana, to the local drug dealers, thugs, and robbers. No one knew. Don basically had set up a small marijuana organization that operated day and night. Don mastered Tierra's neighborhood. He would exit from the newly uncovered entrance. The road construction was complete. The respect level in the neighborhood for Don was on high alert. Not a soul attempted to approach or stop Tierra's car. Don kept Tierra, or Shallot said she kept herself so high dipping in Don's marijuana bag, she didn't realize how deep of a frenzy Don had the neighborhood in. He had it sewed up. Gray Eyes and Don's relationship grew strong, and Don was buying 2 pounds twice a week. Don was never a marijuana seller. He always knew one would have to sell its volume in order to see a profit, so he tried to move as safe and fast as he possibly could. Tierra seemed to not be so happy when there was no marijuana around, and fell into a funk at times, snapping at Don. He paid her outbursts no mind. He was too busy making money as fast as he could, at times thinking about his severe parole conditions only he knew about. The Kappa Phi Kappa fraternity called, and it was time for Don to his new job. Don dropped everything, leaving the 2 pounds stashed between Yasmin and at Tierra's apartment. If anything, he knew Tierra would make sales and put the cash in the top dresser drawer. It was the first day in the huge old rundown kitchen in the frat house. Brothers from the frat administration walked through, introducing themselves one by one, leaving an air of happiness that someone new was ready to cook for them, and meetings. The first couple of trips to Harris Teeter, the frat administration would accompany Don to help out with the groceries they specifically wanted, and then weeks later, they had Don on file to grab a check and go shop alone. Don purchased so much food, he turned the frat house into his own little northern grill. Don had trays of food for days, as well as groceries in bulk. The frat boys didn't care. Don had them fed well. If they wanted seconds, thirds, fourths of heaping servings, Don always had it hot and ready to go, like the drugs he knew how to professionally sell. Don would cram Tierra's fridge with all kinds of groceries, cold cuts, and frozen meats. Her cabinets and pantry's doors were falling off the hinges. There was so much food. The hospitality Don showed Tierra had spread down to Atlanta to her friends, and they all were eager to meet this distinctive man named Don. Tierra would go down to Doris's apartment on the weekends, and when she didn't have class to play cards and smoke, then she would go pick Don up from the frat house. Don always stayed steps ahead, especially after he fell 5 years ago to serve a prison bid. He promised himself to always stay aware of his surroundings and the people in his life. Don called his cousin Leron and told him he had been working at the frat house on Smith Level Road, and he could stop by later to scoop him. That would be highly appreciated. Leron pulled up as the sun was setting, and he met Don and the frat boys. Don would always bring Leron around to take the focus off his sharp edges, being fresh out from prison. Leron was a Christian jokester and would always end every debating conversation with a message of God's word. Don learned fast that in the South no one questions religion. Leron needed an extra hand at these condominiums slightly off of Franklin Street, so Don joined him to get the rust off of him. Don remembered the carpentry work process, so the two hit nails and posted up frames throughout the night, falling asleep in the condo. Don woke up noticing that Leron was working on several of the condominiums. Leron loved playing his music as he walked from condo to condo, making the needed repairs. Don walked over to Don in condo number 7 and asked him, "Cousin, how much do these condos go for, Bo?" Leron replied, "They run about $800 a month. The owner who owns all of these properties here and in town is a close friend of mine. I can take you to the office and introduce you if you like, right after we finish working on these condos. The office is the big glass taekwondo studio as you enter this development." Don said yes, eager to go and meet Leron's friend. Leron and Don walked into the glass martial arts studio, and a class was in session. They quietly watched along for several minutes, and the instructor came walking over in his dobok, wrapped with a black belt. Doug bowed and introduced himself. "Hello, it's a pleasure to meet you, Don. I have heard so many great things about you. I would like to thank you for helping your cousin Leron out with fixing up my properties." Right then and there, it hit Don that all of the mansions and collegiate apartments Leron had him tag along on were owned by this gentleman standing in front of him. Leron got straight to the point and inquired about an open condo for lease for Don. Doug said, "Sure, I'm certain Jennifer can help you with that," as he extended out his arm towards a glass office door. Jennifer was an elderly anorectic blonde female who wore big glasses. The deal was done, 1, 2, 3, and she gave Don a set of keys and said, "Welcome to our little family." Leron's plan was to keep Don close because finding good help was hard to find. Don had an airtight schedule. He would make marijuana sales throughout the day, shop and cook at the frat house in the afternoon, and help Leron out at night. Don kept his volume the same with Gray Eyes, which was the 2 times a week, 2-pound pickup. Work started consuming Don's free time, and Tierra's attitude started changing. Don noticed it and started slowly moving his belongings and his computer over to his new secret condo at 7 Briar Lane. Don never mixed business with pleasure or any two businesses together. UNC football season was approaching. The Kappa Phi Kappa fraternity was one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest, in the area. Don really lucked up. The frat dragged him to all types of games and events. Don never attended college, and where he came from, people looked down on the thought of attending a college. Don now begged to differ. He started wrapping his head around all he missed out in life and felt a rise of depression shooting through his body. He calmed his anxiety by looking at who he used to be, to who he was, and who he could become with the golden opportunity he had in hand. CS called, "He long time no hear Bo. What you know good." Don told CS that he missed him, and he has been working out at the frat house for several months. CS asked him if he was still involved with Tierra, and Don said yes. CS told Don he had quit Northern Grill and was thinking about joining the sheriff department. Don ushered him to go for it, and that he had his support, rather feeling funny deep inside, stemming from where he came from. Don told him to just do one thing, not to change who he is, and not to change on him. CS told Don that he had his word and he would never change on him. One weekend, Don decided to pay CS a visit at his home. A Latin girl answered CS's door. Don had a strange look on his face, but he smiled pleasantly. "Okay, CS, my boy." He was happy CS had gotten over Sarah and found a new flame to light his fire. CS brought Don into the kitchen and gave an update on his life. He explained to Don that Emma was his new fiancée and he planned to marry her. Don said, "Hold up, Bo, hold up. I know I haven't been around in months. Don't you think you're moving too fast?" CS told him that Emma was loyal and he's been at home with her for months, and she's been his only support in his new endeavor on becoming a sheriff. He's been out of work for a while and has been struggling, and Emma has been in his corner each step of the way. Don had liked that pimp shit, and he always felt a man needed a down-ass woman. Don gave CS dap and said, "Well, she's all right with me." CS commanded Don to follow him in the kitchen. CS pulled a plastic sandwich bag with a white powdery substance out of his pants pocket and asked Don if he knew anything about cocaine. Don jumped back. Whoa, CS, what hell are you doing? You trying to set me up?" CS told Don to calm down. He said, "Bo, this is how Emma and I have been surviving over the past months. She's from Ecuador, South America, and she can get plenty of this." Don told CS, "But you're not a drug dealer, and you're talking about being a cop on top of that." Don saw his life spin before his eyes. He couldn't believe what he was hearing and who he was hearing it from. He's heard many renditions of the culture in the dirty South and about how dirty the cops are, which he had his share of run-ins with. This was just weird and out of the norm. Don's hustling senses were on high alert, and on the other end of his nerves, his mind was saying, "Well, how do you think real cartel plugs appear in real life? They don't always meet in abandoned warehouses with one swinging dimly lit lamp and machine guns." Don said, "Well, what are you thinking?" CS said, "Aren't you still over there with Tierra, or are you in Chapel Hill most of the time?" Don told CS that he still stays over at Tierra's place. "So let's put something out there on the street over there," CS said. Don told CS, to his knowledge, those youngsters only sell crack over on Guess Road. They don't sell coke. CS told Don he figured that and tried to cook the cocaine several nights before and lost the entire batch. Don laughed. "You don't know what you're doing, Bo." CS asked Don if he knew how to transform cocaine into crack, and Don replied, "I'm a world-class chef, Bo," as CS slowly cracked a mischievous smile ear to ear. Don told CS to deliver the cocaine to Tierra's, and he would prepare it and move it on the street. Don walked into Tierra's apartment half frightened, not knowing what to believe. Were the parole board or feds trying to set him back in prison for the rest of his natural life? Or was he just overwhelmed? He told Tierra what CS proposed, and she told Don, "Don't you trust that cracker. Bae, if you know what you're doing, I'm all here for you," as she lit up a blunt in Don's presence. CS knocked on the door and had let CS in, greeting him with a stank smile. CS slid the cocaine into Don's hand and left fast as he came. Don got to work, dropping the white substance into a Pyrex glass measuring cup and turning the white sand into a hard cookie, and out the door he flew to go move it to the youngsters as fast as he could. On the street, Don realized with crack the drug game is different and different territorial rules applied. He also knew how to level up above the petty street runners and peddlers, as he sold Rocco 8 balls and quarters. Don kept the weight at that limit for safety reasons. CS would ride his motorcycle and meet Don and deliver more cocaine on the back blocks that were opposite of Tierra's apartments. Don would stand over the stove and perform his magic trick and return to the streets to supply Rocco. CS was money thirsty, and later it came out he was in deep debt, and he kept the mild pressure on Don to help him move the cocaine to the point he continued to beg Don to see if any of his wealthy frat boys would be interested in buying some cocaine. Don didn't want to ruin his beautiful relationship and livelihood he had in Chapel Hill, not to mention the thought of getting busted about what that would look like on a major national D1 campus. One evening, the frat house had a kickback celebration. Beer pong, bong smoking, and dancing took the night by storm. William, who was one of the wealthiest, whispered in Don's ear, "Hey, bud, I know you got that nose candy, dude." Don looked at William in disgust, playing it off as if he felt he racially discriminated against him. At the same time in his head he said, "Bingo," and called CS on speed dial, telling to get his ass to the frat house with the coke ASAP. In a blink of an eye, CS was walking through the party as if he was a frat. He located Don dressed in a tight leather jacket with a jaw full of snuff, aggressively whispering in Don's ear, "Who wants it? Where is he at?" Don told CS to calm down, be smooth, and that he's really acting like a cop and being very suspicious. Don laughed and introduced CS to William, and CS made the transaction. Don's rule was to never ever touch any drug ever again, although he viewed marijuana as a pastime hobbyist high. William introduced Don and CS to Ricky Bobby, the college's #1 runner, and to the UNC's underground world of wealthy addicts of professors and students. Certain nights, CS and Don switched cars, and they would use Tierra's car to attend the raving college parties. CS and Ricky Bobby would constantly get into arguments. He recognized that CS wasn't a seasoned drug dealer, and he was right. CS watched too many Mexican drug cartel documentaries in his off time. The easy pay track started becoming wearisome at times with CS and Ricky Bobby, so Don had altered the direction of the parties and illegal encounters. Don told CS that he thinks they should step away from the frat house. The volume was erratic, and he couldn't afford the administration to get on to him. CS did whatever Don said. He knew Don was the real hustler. Also, he was determined to make any extra cash he could. Don opened up his old shredded pocket phone book he had throughout his prison vacation. He went to the S section and dialed up his OG partner Solo, a solid, quiet lip, big, legendary, hustling country boy who had put the feather in Don's hat when it came to down south hustling. The two were inseparable and known to move tons in days. Don had put Solo down with the play, "What's Been Going Down with CS?" and he popped up at Tierra's door to attend the sit-down. Don had asked CS for some weight, and he delivered it in his sheriff's car. He walked up the level 3, and Don opened the apartment's door. CS dropped off a quarter key of pure Colombian cocaine trafficked through Ecuador off the crystal-clear blue shores of South America. CS left, and Solo entered the apartment minutes later, as the two never crossed paths. Tierra was at her parents' house this weekend, so the place was quiet and ready for the cook. Solo masked up and said, "Like old times, Bo," sliding the respirator mask over his mouth and nose. Don cooked away and stretched the cocaine as Solo weighed and bagged the huge hard crystals sparkling dried pieces of crack. Like an assembly line in formation, Don cleaned and cleared the place of any evidence and residue, while Solo exited the apartment with the huge package of drugs under his jacket. The next afternoon, Solo appeared back at Tierra's place with $15,000 in cash, and the next 2 flips were identical to the first process and exchange. Don called CS, and he told CS to bring double the amount of cocaine he last brought several days. CS pulled up in the sheriff's car with a kilo of cocaine and came up to Tierra's house to meet Don, and by surprise, he was introduced to Solo. CS said, "So you are the one moving this weight like water? I like my money fast." CS was an amateur big money counter. Solo would arrange the money in hundreds, then throw some 50s in some of the bricks of money, and sometimes test to see if you really could count big cash by adding some 20s in the middle. That was one of his ways to see if a man was mature to handle big drug deals, or if he was a phony. That test would determine his necessary actions to be taken further down the line in the business relationship. CS miscounted several times, and Don and Solo looked on, shaking their heads. Don knew the play Solo was running on CS. CS just grabbed up the money in a hasty manner, shoving all the money bricks in every pocket of his jacket. He then dropped a bag with a kilo of cocaine on the living room's table and said, "Have my money in 2-3 days top." CS saluted Don, looked at Solo in his sheriff uniform, and exited the apartment. Solo gave Don dap and left, heading up 85 North. The weekend was one to remember, and Tierra returned to her quiet, peaceful home with open arms, happy to see Don. The night ended with a peaceful dinner and movie, and Tierra listening to how the weekend was very prosperous, besides the vague moment between CS miscounting the money and rubbing Solo the wrong way. Tierra didn't care to hear about CS, so she spent the night taking Don to ecstasy. A week passed by, and there was no call or response from Solo. Don ran out of options on deciding to call him again and told Tierra he needed to take a ride to investigate what was going on with Solo. Don and Solo have been friends for over 2 decades, and his behavior was strange out of the clear blue. Don cruised 2.5 hours away to one of Solo and his drug spots tucked deep away in Warren County. Don called CS and told him he was going to locate Solo to retrieve their money, looking and searching for familiar countryside landmarks that would signal the right turns to Solo's country abode. Don made a sharp, slow turn onto a grassy patch and followed the homemade path to a small shack in the distance, with thick clouds of smoke lifting from its chimney. Don slowed the car down as huge Rottweilers danced around the nose of the car. A man walked up wearing a black Dickies jumpsuit with black Timberlands. It was Solo. Don exited the car and met Solo in the middle of the field. Don held his hands out like a cross, signaling he was lost for words and confused about Solo's silent actions. Both men's faces were solid stone. Solo said, "Today's your day. How much money do you want?" And his shiny black face cracked a smile. He said, "Ain't no cracker goin' ever talk to me like that. That cracker ain't no hustler." "Fuck that cracker." Don laughed and gave Solo dap and said, "How much can I have?" Solo told him whatever he wanted and gave him a duffel bag containing 60 grand. "Welcome home, OG," Solo said to Don as he lit up a cigarette. Don placed the duffel bag in the trunk of his car and dialed up Tierra. "Baby, tell CS I'm deep out here in the country, and these country boys got guns to my head." Tierra said, "Obey, my pleasure." Clicked over and called CS. To be continued.